Hi, I'm Jeff Nyquist, and this is another edition of Friends and Enemies with my co-host Alex Benesch in Germany. I'm Jeff Nyquist in the United States. Lots of news happening now. It looks like Tulsi Gabbard is going to be cleared to be the Director of National Intelligence. It looks like Robert Kennedy Jr. is going to be the Health Secretary, and so it's interesting. You've got revelations out of Ukraine. Coming first out of the mouth of President Zelensky that of the 177 billion sent to Ukraine, only 70, what did he say, 25 billion have come, over 100 billion is missing. General Kellogg is saying there's going to be an investigation that it looks like the money was stolen here on the American side. That's really interesting. People talk about how corrupt Ukraine is. How could this happen? This is very serious. The Biden administration was not really supporting Ukraine as they claimed. Yeah. And I had talked on this, Alex, I've said that Ukraine wasn't receiving everything the Biden administration would send out. I had a source that said that the procurement guy was baffled in the Pentagon. There's these young people coming from the White House saying that, we're sending this and that to Ukraine, and I'm the guy that would be sending it, and I don't know what they're talking about, right? Told to sit down and shut up. So anyway, it's pretty interesting. I don't know if you followed any of that, Alex. And then, of course, we've got the Russians are building up in the Savaki Gap. There's a story. I have a source that says Putin had open heart surgery yesterday. Today's Saturday, whenever this is broadcast. Maybe the open heart surgery was on Thursday. But that it was successful, that they're hiding that the Russians would have attacked the Savaki Gap already if Putin had been healthy. And there's a dispute between Putin and Kim. I guess the losses of the North Korean troops have been a bit more catastrophic than the North Koreans kind of expected, and they're not happy. And of course, the Russians have expanded their ability to mobilize and train troops, and they are training them, and they are Putin has authorized the use of nuclear weapons fired from Belarusian soil, which is, again, aiming at NATO, aiming at the Savaki Gap. The reason that the Russians are going to give for attacking and occupying it is to create a secure corridor to the Kaliningrad salient. There's a section of Russia that is a little island of Russian territory between Poland and Lithuania called Kaliningrad. It's got a naval base, it's got air bases, it's got missiles.
Yeah, it used to be Germany.
And it used to be Germany. It used to be East Prussia. It used to be called the city of Königsberg, right?
Yeah, that was a long time ago, and a lot has happened in between. Now, when the NATO expansion became an issue in the 90s, and ultimately, as everybody should be aware, the Russians agreed to it, especially in 1997. When that became a political debate, several experts, especially from the United States, they weighed in with their opinions, and some calculations were done by some very, very clever think tanks and organizations of that nature. And they tried to calculate the amount of money necessary to properly defend Eastern Europe in the 90s and the 2000s and onwards. So that was a staggering calculation at the time, and this is why some of the conservative experts, the conservative politicians at the time from the United States, that's when they became a bit skeptical about the numbers that were being tossed around, right? Because it's not like people have been told, right? It's like this idea that it's these right-wingers or whatever or whoever who would expand NATO at all costs and anger the Russians and betray the Russians and all that nonsense. But it was a careful consideration how much to invest, how much to do in what way, because you mentioned the Suwalki Gap, and the territory here in Europe basically dictated a lot of security considerations, and still do, right? Because when you calculate the defense of a territory that is pretty flat, and there's no mountains, high mountains to protect it. There's no ocean in between to protect you from the Russians. There's no natural boundary of that sort. That can drive up the costs significantly. Now, today, with better weapon systems, that changed, of course, somewhat. But for a long time, this was kind of an issue with NATO expansion, which was carefully considered. And also, when you have flat territory, this was an issue for Ukraine for a very long time, and for Poland for a very long time. Now, Ukrainians, they always wanted to be Ukrainians, for a very long time, wanted to have their own language, wanted to have their own system and have control of their lives, but it was so difficult for Ukrainians to be Ukrainians because of the lack of natural boundaries. And it's hard to establish yourself when these natural boundaries are missing, and the Russians know that. That's why they always made up these excuses why Ukrainians are really Russians. So yeah, that's kind of an issue that's very, very European. I understand that Americans are not used to that because the United States is protected by oceans, right? But
we're not used to continental thinking where you've got a flat country, open country like Germany is in the north, where you can be invaded easily, or Ukraine or Russia or Poland, flat open ground, so northern France.
It's a technology. It's become a technology race. I mean, we saw the new type of warfare in Ukraine, the drones, the Javelin rockets, and some other longer range missiles. That became a factor counterbalancing the drawbacks of the flat territory in many of these places. So this is why the Russian propaganda is funded so well, and why they use assets in the West, media, internet, or traditional media, the new internet media, and politics. There's so many assets cultivated to tell the world that Ukraine is losing, Ukraine is not really Ukraine, blah, 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 just so that money is not being invested in the security of Europe and Eastern Europe, just so Ukraine doesn't get the things necessary to defend Ukrainian territory. That's why all the talking is so important, right? Because from a technological standpoint, the Russians have problems, and they have so many problems, and the Russians try to counterbalance their own weaknesses by using strategic propaganda and by using a network of assets to tell the world to abandon Ukrainians. And I was following recent comments by General Kellogg, the new special envoy for Ukraine, and Kellogg said some very interesting things. He said that it's a team, it's a group effort. It's not just Trump, as the media would have you believe, who's making all these decisions. It's a carefully crafted plan. He said there's a variety of people involved, the National Security Council, all these experts involved. And Kellogg strongly indicated a tough deal against the Russians. We still don't have a confirmation of what it's going to be, but his argument is the sanctions against Russia have only just begun. He said on a scale from 0 to 10, we're now at a 3. And so what if it goes to a 4? What if it goes to a 5? And we saw how hard of a time the Russians had against the Ukrainians, even though Ukrainians only received a fraction of what they'd been promised by the Biden administration. Imagine if they had gotten all that they were promised by the Biden administration. It wouldn't be a 3 out of 10 now, or it wouldn't be a problem of the current magnitude for the Russians. It would be a much bigger problem. And so, you mentioned Kennedy confirmation. You mentioned the Tulsi Gabbard confirmation. We talked about Tulsi Gabbard, I think, in the last episode. And so it's so important to talk about influence and an outright foreign control, spies, assets, and traitors and moles, but this discussion has to be done very professionally. And it's nice to see that the topic is back. I mean, for so long, and for 1991, people had abandoned the topic, And even in European countries, intelligence or foreign intelligence work had been scaled down, and it had been converted away from protecting against Russia, protecting against China, converted to protection against Muslim extremism and this, that, and the other. And so there was a lack of experts on Russian espionage. There was a lack of experts on Chinese espionage. So now the topic is back. Most people are now talking about spies and traitors and moles. But this discussion is often very unprofessional, and it's oftentimes outright misleading. So I thought maybe today we should compare some historical cases, and then compare it to this idea that's been tossed around for so long. This idea that Donald Trump is a Russian asset, and there's people that have worked in intelligence. They came out with books on it. They started with a conclusion, very narrow focus, single agenda, single scenario. Started from there and just kept adding on to that narrative, even though that's not what a professional would do, in my opinion. I think that's kind of a general. It's fair to say that this is kind of a general assessment. So people had forgotten about James Angleton. People had been had been talking trash about James Angleton, the expert on counterintelligence. But now we have to wonder. We might be a few years away from a major war, global scale war. What about the intelligence angle? How do we deal with the topic of espionage, and from different perspectives? Because you and I, we've dealt with these topics for so long, and it really takes many years to become really good at that. But there's other influencers out there. There are voters out there. There's people that are politically active out there. What do they need to understand about talking about these matters? What are the most important things to take away from all of this? So maybe we should. I've got some notes here on a very specific book on Trump. I have some notes on Alger Hiss, the guy that seemed so perfect on paper for the left. He could have become president of the United States, right? He could have become president.
I've had Alger Hiss's book here, where he makes fun of Nixon and denies that he was a Soviet agent. But the problem is, they have the Venona decrypts, and they have the testimony of Whittaker Chambers and Elizabeth Bentley about the Silver Master spy ring. It's pretty clear. In fact, what's really interesting is at the end of the Cold War, when the Soviets were pretending to be, transparent with Glasnost, they tried to claim that Alger Hiss was never one of their spies.
Yeah, right.
And there was such an uproar from the American side saying, "Are you kidding? You're trying to lie to us about that now?" So in other words, there was no glass. They weren't transparent. They were even good. And then, of course, they realized from this reaction they'd made a mistake by trying to claim that, he was innocent. And then they backed off. But they weren't willing to show what they had, showing what he had done. There has not been any real coming clean by the Russian Federation or from Gorbachev when they claimed that they were going to. All the releases of information from Soviet archives, including the Soviet archive of the Communist Party USA that was held in Moscow, all of those were calculated releases of information, if you really look at it closely. And I've talked to Russians in the intelligence business about this, and they've confirmed this to me, that that's what it was, in every detailed instance.
Yeah, and this is kind of like this paradoxical situation where a guy like Alger Hiss looked perfect to the left on paper. I mean, he was a liberal. He was very stylish. He dressed nice. He was nice looking. Highly educated.
Went to all the right schools. And of course, he was the guy that was wheeling Roosevelt, FDR, around in his wheelchair at Yalta.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
I'm exaggerating slightly. I mean, he was an important person, advisor. He was the Assistant Secretary of State And the other big spy, by the way, in that Silver Master ring, the big name was Harry Dexter White, who was Assistant Secretary of the Treasury. But Henry Morgenthau, who was a Treasury Secretary during World War II, was kind of an absentee landlord. He let White had a kind of genius for Treasury stuff. And of course, among the allegations against, and there's no doubt, again, we've got the Venona decrypts, there's no doubt that Harry Dexter White was a Soviet agent. You've got the story of the transferring of U.S. Currency plates to the Soviet Union so they could counterfeit our money. Well, it wouldn't really be counterfeiting; it was the authentic plates, right? That there was Harry Dexter White had orchestrated.
Imagine the passport plates or the passport technology to get maybe.
Well, yeah, I mean, if that, I don't know if he did. It was, I think the plates, they were money, they were U.S. dollar plates, but you had with Harry Dexter White, if I recall, there's a book called Operation Snow, written by an American some years ago, about how Pearl Harbor came about, how the Japanese ended up attacking us, and Harry Dexter White, as a Soviet agent, he met with one of the top Soviet officials who actually bragged about it. I think it's in Suda Platov's book too, about meeting at the Willard Hotel in Washington with Harry Dexter White and laying out, you have to provoke Japan for us. Because what had happened right then in 1941, the Soviet Union was invaded by Nazi Germany, and Japan was part of the Anti-Comintern Pact, right? The Axis. Japan was only at war with China at the time, but there was the possibility that Japan could make a deal with China and turn its army against the Soviet Union to join the Nazis and attack the Soviets from the east, right? Which would have been catastrophic for the Soviet Union. And it's exactly what Stalin was terrified of. And in fact, Stalin, as the war progressed in 1941, Stalin was in need of his armies that were watching the Japanese. The Japanese controlled Manchuria and the more significant parts of China then, because the Sino-Japanese War had started in 1937, and so it was very important for Stalin to recall his Siberian armies to the Eastern Front to fight the Germans, and of course he couldn't do that unless Japan was busy elsewhere, and of course the Japanese army was saying, let's make some kind of agreement in China and let's redirect the army against the Soviet Union so we can get rid of this problem. But the Navy was saying, no, we can grab the Indonesian oil, we can grab the Philippines, we can secure the resources that Japan needs because these Americans over here are pressuring us about China, telling us to get out of China, etc. And of course, there was a lot of angst about the Japanese treatment, the Shanghai, the rape of Nanking, the taking of all these Japanese, Chinese cities rather. So what happened is that the U.S. in 1941 put pressure on Japan to end the war with China on terms that were not acceptable to Japan, and Harry Dexter White was tasked with writing the telegram, writing the diplomatic note saying what economic sanctions would be, and what the Soviets wanted is for him to make it appropriately insulting to the Japanese, so there was no face saving for Japan, and so that this would destroy the balance within the Japanese cabinet.
Sabotage.
For going to war against the Soviet Union, which would have finished the Soviet Union off. Because in the Battle of Moscow, which was developing in October, November 1941, Stalin offered Hitler terms of peace. Like, what do I have to do to get you to stop? And he asked Beria, the head of the NKVD, to look for a place, another country they could flee to, because it looked like, and they were evacuating Moscow, and they were creating a second capital deep behind the front because they thought it was going to fall. The German pincers in Operation Typhoon, which was the German offensive, the Germans had been so successful on all the other fronts. They captured Ukraine. They had Leningrad under siege in the north, looked like that was going to fall. They took all their panzer divisions, maybe except for one. They massed everything. Now, they're greatly attrited. These panzer divisions aren't at full strength because they've been fighting all summer, but they massed them all on Moscow. And they bagged like, what was it? 600,000, 500,000 Russian troops off the bat, Soviet troops, and there was nothing to stop them. In fact, the only thing that stopped them in the end was that Stalin felt confident that Pearl Harbor was going to happen. The Japanese, remember, the Japanese First Air Fleet that bombed Pearl Harbor departed for that mission in like mid-November 1941. So Stalin knew, when he made the decision to stay in Moscow and to bring the Siberian troops back, to strip the border defenses against Japan, he knew that Pearl Harbor was the decision because he had orchestrated it and he had spies. Sorge was his famous spy in Japan that helped him in Japan. And then he had Harry Dexter White in the Treasury. So this shows you the war-winning. I mean, literally, Harry Dexter White, if we accept the interpretation of the book Operation Snow, saved the Soviet Union in the fall of 1941. Saved it. Yeah. And of course, there was the weather thing on December 5th. The temperatures on that front dropped to 40 below, and the German army was paralyzed. But if there hadn't been these extra troops showing up, they probably would have reached Moscow before the weather turned, before December 5th.
Yeah, and we can.
So anyway, it's all the ifs of history, but this is how the spy thing matters so much.
Yeah, and it's not just one spy can cause just cosmic amounts of damage. It's always built as a net of spies. It's always like this, several people, and one of them is helping the others, and there's like an extra help, and they always try to have a net.
Talk a little bit about the Rote Kapelle.
What you mean? What aspect you have in mind? Because
it's an example of what you're talking about. It's not just one spy, although one of the spies was a key one, giving the information, and of course the theory that it was Martin Bormann.
Yeah.
Was the key spy in the Red Orchestra. Rote Kapelle is Red Orchestra for the
by
English
a method
speakers.
of elimination, by a straightforward method of elimination, there was only one person who could have been a particular spy. So we know the code name, we know roughly or pretty.
Was it Albert? Am I remembering that right? The code name was Albert.
Werther. I think it was it Werther?
Oh, yes, you're right. Yeah, right.
So this is kind of a typical thing that happens over and over again, and we will present some examples of this in the show. So through intercepts, through various means, and deduction,
and
logic.
Explain how vital that network was. I mean, they did.
It's like there was some radio transmissions intercepted. So this is what saved the Soviet Union in World War II, right? Because if you always know in advance where the Germans will be at that point, what they have, what the reserves are, what they will do next, of course it makes Russia's job that much easier. And so it became more and more clear, and we have a paper trail of that through intercepts and some spies that have been caught and tortured for information by the Nazis. We know from the paper trail that a spy existed by a code name like Werther, and we know that in the transcripts there were other spies with other code names, and they were supplying information from all these very, very high places. Now, of course, there was only one person who was so close to Hitler all the time. Martin Bormann never took a holiday as far as anybody could remember, and
he was Hitler's basically personal secretary who got into this position because he'd been Hess's secretary, and Hess
and he's been
made fatal flight to England.
Exactly, Bormann had been part of this movement for so long. He was he was basically a kid or almost a kid in World War I. Then he had the right contacts, quote unquote, the Freikorps groups of armed former government soldiers, and the early Nazi movement and all the stuff that they pulled. And when you were in that circle and you had the right friends, then you could have a lightning career in the Nazi system. So we know.
And he was, by the way, we should mention that Martin Bormann had this gift of ability to juggle details and to keep things in his head and to manage things. And of course, Hitler was the opposite. Hitler was an artist. He was creative. He
impulsive.
He was not a guy. Very impulsive. And it was not an organized. He was mentally organized, but he was not. He needed somebody to organize for him. Of course, Hitler had an astonishing memory, but he did not. Yeah, he wasn't able to organize like he needed a Martin Bormann.
And it was an astounding espionage achievement to manage the flow of information to Hitler and from Hitler, and to frame every important pre-frame and post-frame every important conversation that Hitler had, because Hitler had this concept of constantly inviting a specific general. So one day he would have this guy come over for a talk, and then he had the other guy. So every time this would be pre-planned, Martin Bormann, he got on this. He knew who was going to be invited, what this general was complaining about, what this general was about. And so Bormann could then pre-frame this upcoming conversations. He could come up with a plan, influence Hitler, and tell Hitler, when this general arrives, he will try to manipulate you, he will try to pull this and pull that. So Hitler went into this talk with a limited, narrow vision, and the rest was, of course, Hitler's rambling and impulsiveness that sometimes happened with him. And after the general had left from that talk with Hitler, Bormann could also do a post talk with Hitler and say, "Oh, see, I told you the general would bring up this, and I told you this was coming, and blah 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 blah." So this is kind of like what a spy can do. So we know from the paper trail that a spy of that caliber existed. We know what the information the spy delivered. We know code names of other high-ranking spies that delivered highly valuable information of a large caliber. So then it becomes a job of further investigation and logical deduction. Who could have possibly been the spy, the person behind that Soviet code name? And that is 101 spy work. So you look at the information and you start to eliminate candidates. You start to narrow down the circle of prime suspects, and eventually you will end up with a smaller and smaller group. Sometimes there's only one person left who could possibly logically have fulfilled that spy role.
Besides that, I should add, we have direct testimony from the head of the Abwehr section watching the Eastern Front, Reinhard Gehlen, who actually says in his memoirs, talks about evidence that he and Admiral Canaris found that Martin Bormann was working for the Stalin, and talks about having caught Martin Bormann operating transmitters, transmitting signals to Stalin, disguising, having convinced Hitler that this was a back channel to Stalin for negotiating, but he's sending information directly through not just one transmitter. And then you have the striking testimony of Walter Schellenberg, who is very subtle in what he says. And of course, Schellenberg is one that he was perhaps one of the only top SS generals, and he was the youngest SS general, head of SS Foreign Intelligence, who had Western sympathies. They used to joke and call him a liberal within the Nazi movement, say, "You're not really a Nazi, you're a liberal." But Himmler liked him and protected Schellenberg. Schellenberg said after the war in his memoir, which is in in one of the editions published in English, it's called The Labyrinth. He actually describes the head of the Gestapo, Heinrich Gestapo Müller, trying to recruit him. And I think in the spring of 1943, after the Battle of Stalingrad, when it's clear that Germany's going to lose the war, he recounts this recruitment attempt where the guy who's in charge of hunting the Red Orchestra, Müller, is trying to recruit him. And he hints in there that how many of the Nazi officials then would be recruited, being afraid because the pitch was, if you don't join Stalin now, when the Red Army gets here, you're going to be hanged, right?
Yeah.
This is what Schellenberg says. And Schellenberg talks about how, this is really interesting, and we should all pay attention to this, how that Martin Bormann, he suspected Martin Bormann, and he said Martin Bormann and Müller basically did this game, did this game. And why is my camera doing this? They did this game where they pretended to be enemies with each other. But he writes in the memoir, no, I suspect that they're working together. I think they are. And of course, there's lots of evidence that they were working together.
Yeah, and sometimes it takes years, sometimes it takes decades until we can narrow down the suspects, or we end up with one person who logically must have been an agent, a traitor with a specific code name. So these things take time, and same with today when people are asking, what about this politician? What about that guy? What about this person?
What about Trump? And this gets back to your point about, we had this discussion.
Maybe I should add one more recent example to this before we get into Trump. This is on Counterintel.com. The story has the headline, Secret Diary Revealed of Hitler's Closest Contact from Britain's High Nobility. It's the diaries of Unity Mitford. That was the lady's name from a very old aristocratic
The Mitford
family.
sisters were friends of Hitler. I think one of them married Oswald Mosley, right?
Mosley, that's right, exactly. And
the
one of them,
leading pro-Nazi British politician.
yeah,
very notorious.
And so one of the Mitford sisters actually was a communist. She was always described as the red sheep of the family, and it's been known for a while that for a time when they were kids, Unity Mitford and Jessica Mitford, they had a shared room together, right? And at some point when they became teenagers and politically confused, they drew a line, like a chalk line, to separate the two halves of the room, and one half supposedly was adorned with communist posters and memorabilia. So one side of the room was the communist side, and the other side was the fascist side. And interestingly enough, Jessica Mitford actually became the biggest inspiration for the world-famous British author J.K. Rowling, who wrote the Harry Potter series. J.K. Rowling actually named her daughter Jessica after Jessica Mitford, the communist aristocrat red sheep of the family, right? Just so people understand the Mitford clan and its lasting impact. So what recently happened, this was maybe 3 weeks ago, roughly 3 weeks ago, the Daily Mail newspaper, they presented the sensation. They said, we found the diaries, the leather-bound diaries of Unity Mitford, who was so close to Hitler for so long, and nobody quite knew what to make out of it. And this is now filling some important.
Didn't she try to commit suicide when the war ended?
It's debated because intelligence
started.
Yeah, because intelligence, even British intelligence people said, we have no definitive proof that she really tried to shoot herself or kill herself. Because of her important, powerful father and his connections, she was just brought back to Britain. there's some footage of that. She looks pretty normal on the footage, and that became sort of a question mark in British intelligence at the time. And so this diary has now appeared after such a long time. Now we have some additional data.
Is it going to be public?
In pieces, I think they made a series out of it.
How incredible! What a find!
In the Daily Mail, and there's been, I mean, the case has been worked on for a long time. There's a documentary series from British television. People can find it on YouTube. It's called Hitler's British Girl, and so now we have more data. The Daily Mail is presenting it as a sensation. What the Daily Mail is not telling people is really its own history, because the paper, which used to be much more powerful in the past, during the fascist era, the Daily Mail was run by the Lords Rothermere, and they pushed hard for anti-Semitic conspiracy nonsense. The Daily Mail was advertising for Mussolini in Italy, Hitler and the Nazis, even Mosley's party, the British fascists, and so that's what people are not supposed to remember about all of this. You know, the Daily Mail's
the Daily Mail
own history
back in the late 30s, huh?
And so so basically, we still can't tell at this point if Unity Mitford, what was her actual goal with all of this? Why did she become?
Do you think? But hold on, let me ask you now the intelligence question. Given her relationship with Hitler, wouldn't MI6 have approached her and tried to recruit her?
Absolutely.
And wouldn't her family have put pressure on her to actually be a spy for her country?
But also if she ever shared details about the Nazi leadership, because she was so close to everybody, if she ever shared details with a family member, we know her sister was a communist. I mean, who knows where this information ended up? And so there's so many interesting, fascinating options when it came to that. And this is kind of an example that is still being talked about. You know, we're still working on that case. So now
In other words, there are mysteries about who was spying for who going back, 80 years now that we don't know.
Yeah, and
it's like don't know now.
It's interesting to see how Unity Mitford. I mean, her second name was Valkyrie, and she even made Hitler's. Yeah, she even made Hitler's so-called wife jealous. There's written, I think, even the diaries.
Eva Braun was jealous of her,
yes.
huh?
Yes, there's written like entries in a diary where she says, "I'm sitting here moping. I feel humiliated because this Mitford woman. She's taller than me. She's got light hair, and her second name is Valkyrie, and the Nazis all adore her. And it's interesting to see how Unity Mitford and Lord Rothermere with the Daily Mail, how they all pushed this traditional anti-Jewish conspiracy nonsense. I mean, even in the Daily Mail, I have some quotes here from the Daily Mail, and Unity Mitford was speaking at Nazi rallies, the whole bit, and so at some point, when Britain was really at war with Germany, she had to leave Germany. Supposedly committed suicide, or tried to commit suicide. Then she was brought back home to Britain, but British intelligence thought we have no evidence, definitive evidence that she was truly injured. And so here, the father, who was called Mitford's father, he was called Lord Redesdale. He was a member of the so-called Right Club in the 1930s. The group was led by a Tory MP who wrote an anthem called Land of Dope and Jewry, which ended with a call to hang Jews. That's the kind of level of public statements at the time. So, and that's and that shows you how easy it sometimes was to infiltrate the Nazis. I mean, whether she was a spy for the British or not, if you say the right words.
Let me just interject something. I think she ultimately died from that bullet that she shot herself with.
She died young.
She was 33. It was made just a couple of years after the war, I think, and she died of I think a meningitis infection from the bullet, because of, whenever you compromise the tissue around the brain, you can get the infiltration of these germs.
But who fired that bullet? Did she do it herself? Was it some German guy?
Yeah, there's the question. I mean, this is tragic. I mean, she was a beautiful young lady. I think she was 33 when she died. She was in her early 30s anyway.
But who fired that bullet?
You think? I mean, did she shoot herself after she returned to the UK, or
no? They say she was so crestfallen when Germany was finally at war with Britain, and it didn't pan out the way she hoped for, because she was always advertising for that British-German alliance. She was so depressed that she just wanted to kill herself. But that's sort of an interpretation we have absolutely no solid evidence for.
She shot herself in the head with a pistol. Is that right?
Maybe somebody shot a bullet at her head. We just don't know who fired the bullet. And
really?
So because she was considered by law, by German Nazi law, she was considered now an enemy, a traitor, because she was aligned with Britain. She was a Brit, and that's why she had to leave the country. She spent years on German soil. She was very.
Didn't she come through Switzerland? Wasn't she hospitalized in Switzerland from the gunshot wound?
Yeah, and she did ask some high-ranking Nazis, how is this going to play out? Because I'm now an enemy of Germany. I am a Brit. I have these family connections. Am I going to be arrested, or is that a possibility of an arrest? And there was a lot of disappointed high-ranking Nazis, who really hated the Brits now. So it's kind of a murky story, and it shows how easy it was for some people to get close to the highest ranks of the Nazi leadership. Whether it's Martin Bormann or it's Unity Mitford, if you say the right words, if you repeat what the Nazis wanted to hear, if you made public statements, if you aligned with the Nazis early, that was oftentimes or sometimes enough to get to the highest levels of the Nazi leadership. And that's kind of the crowning achievement of all espionage, if you can penetrate somebody else that deeply. And so we still don't know what the end game was of Jessica Mitford, or maybe some family members who persuaded her to go to Germany, and maybe report back every once in a while and tell her family or her father or whatever, how are the Nazis, what's going on, who is of what opinion in Germany, who has the ear of der Führer, and all that sort of stuff. So that's just how the game is played. Even decades after the fact. So should we continue with Alger Hiss or Donald Trump?
Well, we need to go back to look at Donald Trump, because there have been these claims, and it goes to the Democrats, and there's conservatives that we know that also are worried and think, there's this claim. Let me give you the Russian angle, and of course, I've read some of the books about Putin's People. You probably know this book.
Catherine Belton, yeah.
Yeah, in this book, part of the book, I think towards the end of it, if I'm remembering correctly, goes into these connections with organized crime and Trump through New York, because the construction business, you can't function.
Yeah. And
there's a motorcycle gang in Florida that's Russian GRU connected biker gangsters, and there's we know that laundering money from KGB sources, SVR now it's called. They use urban real estate as a way to move money and to launder money. And of course, buying expensive real estate through the Trump Organization is something the Russians did. Russian crime organizations. And the claim was that this was the conduit of money. And I think somewhere in the book it quotes Donald Trump's son saying, it's basically Russian money that floated us, that got us out of, because he was he's been in and out of financial trouble in the past. I think at one point after the real estate crash 30 something years ago, there was a big real estate crash in the US. He was a negative billionaire, right?
Yeah,
that is, he
but it was also Deutsche
billions.
Bank. It was also the big institute, the Deutsche Bank that also greatly helped Trump and the Trump family business at some point. And Deutsche Bank, they also were entangled in business that was at some point considered money laundering of some sort, and Deutsche Bank got into trouble for that. So it's like when you're dealing with such information, you have to be extremely careful, and I try to be as careful as I could be over the years. Ever since Trump became president all these years ago, because some amateurs, they kept saying Trump has zero Russian connections. Trump has nothing, absolutely zero, nothing to do with Russians, blah, blah, blah. And that's just not the case. So let's be realistic here. But
that is not the case.
But when we look at these connections, there's so many angles to this. There's so many possible scenarios for this, and that's what you cannot limit yourself to one angle. You cannot limit yourself to one interpretation, and just focus on that. Like an example I picked specifically for this show. This is from a book, and I've read a variety of these books about Trump and the Russians. Now this is from Craig Unger's book, American Compromat, right? Interesting bits of information in there. I mean, I encourage people to read, even though you don't agree with the conclusions of the author or the angle of the author. You should read books regardless. And so this was, so right in the beginning, Craig Unger gives you his framing of the whole Trump affair. He says that fascism was in the air when Trump said something about, what's going to happen when he wins or something or the other, kind of an offhand comment.
Oh, yeah, that's very common, that kind of...
and it's a stupid thing. It's a stupid thing we've been hearing for decades. The Republicans are going to pull off some fascist dictatorship. We heard that during Bush. We heard that during Bush Senior.
Paranoia.
We heard it during Reagan. The left claimed this during the Reagan era. The left claimed this about Nixon. The left claimed this when Eisenhower was president. Just on and on and on. And it never happens. It never happened, right?
No, there's no fascist revolution. No. No, that's exactly right. Now, I should mention 2 points on Trump's background. One is that when he visited maybe I should start with his wives. Okay, Trump he's on his third marriage, right? He was married first to Ivana Trump, who is from a communist country, and there's been allegations that she was connected to the East Bloc services. And I mean, you got somebody from a communist country marrying an American billionaire. You would kind of expect something like that to go on.
Sure.
And she was married to Trump during the Cold War, before the fall of the Berlin, through the fall of the Berlin Wall. They got married in 1977. They were divorced in 1990. So this is one point. They say, oh, look, he has a wife who's from a communist country. Then he married Marla Maples, that you can't really say anything about her, I don't think. And then, of course, in 2005, he married Melania Trump. She's from a communist country. Her parents were in the Communist Party of Yugoslavia. But this is a long time after communist Yugoslavia is gone. It doesn't seem likely that there's any, and Yugoslavia wasn't really part of it was not part of the Soviet bloc. It was a communist country that was sort of independent, supposedly. Well, so this is the claim made. And of course, when he was married to Ivana Trump, he made a trip to the Soviet Union, and he came back and he published things in the New York Times that were, after he had been to the Soviet Union, that were kind of advocating policies that the Soviet Union would have kind of liked at the time, and were kind of they weren't the right policies. Let's put it that way. So that Trump, when he went there, he talked to people. He got an idea of the Soviet Union that was wrong, right? And then he reflected that in his public statements. So people drag that out, together with two of his wives being from communist countries, and then they talk about his trips to the Soviet Union, and then of course. And this is what you find in things like Putin's People and about these roads. So this is sort of the extent of it, but there's no smoking gun. There's nothing. It only kind of reflects that he's an important guy. They've put people around him. They've tried to influence him. They've tried to get things out of him, but it just objectively, it doesn't seem they got very much out of him. I mean, is that how you read it?
Well, I mean, with some of the most damaging spies, they have German ancestors. They look German. They seem perfectly Anglo, and nobody would have ever thought that they might be working for the communists. And so there was some recently declassified files, and this goes back over years. Some files from these are former or old files from Czech intelligence. Some of it was declassified even in 2016. Interesting year, of course. Interesting timing. So they talk about all this backstory. Ivana Tselničková, was her name at the time, and so her parents were kind of expected to. Question the daughter, what's going on with Donald, how is he, blah, blah, blah. And the parents, I think, were expected to report back to the Czech authorities. But that's not the perfect spy operation, right? That's just something you would expect, as you just mentioned. And it's not the perfect spy plot.
That would be normal.
It's not the perfect spy plot. In there's so many other better operations that the Soviets could have pulled against Trump, approaching him from an angle you wouldn't expect, right? Some guy who seems perfectly Anglo or has maybe a German background, like the Trump family itself. It's not the perfect spy operation, right? Go question. A wife of Donald, a wife who comes from a communist country. Interesting to note. People should read up on that, but they shouldn't read too much into that either. And here's an example from Craig Unger's book, American Compromise. This is kind of the biggest issue I have with this book: the narrow focus, the single style of interpreting context of Trump and facts of Trump's life. Now, this bit here, this is about Donald Trump in the past, Trump seeking contacts, which you would expect. This was a contact to the FBI. Now, of course, the FBI is tasked with counterintelligence, catching Russian spies and all that. People, I think, know that at this point. And so the book talks about Mr. Karlstrom. Right, this is like this sounds Nordic, right? The name sounds like Swedish or Norwegian, Karlström or Karlstrom, right?
Sounds Swedish, yeah.
Yeah, sounds Nordic. So Mr. Karlstrom, who ended up running the FBI's New York office in the mid-90s, this office oversaw successful investigations into both the Italian mafia and later the Russian mafia. Mr. Karlstrom had developed friendships with two key players, two key players in the Trump-Russia saga. He worked closely with then U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, Rudy Giuliani, in the investigation of the Cosa Nostra network, that's Italian mafia. Going even further back, Karlstrom had also been friends with Donald Trump since around 1973, when Karlstrom was putting together a parade in New York to honor Vietnam veterans, and Trump came along to fund most of it. "We got to be friends," said Karlstrom in a 2020 interview. He says Trump was very, very supportive of the Bureau. You know, we lose an agent or somebody gets shot up, he was always there to pay for the food or whatever it took. According to the New York Times, Karlstrom had founded the Marine Corps Law Enforcement Foundation, a nonprofit that got more than $1.3 million from Trump, an unusually generous offering, the book says here, from the real estate developer. Karlstrom also said this. He said, Trump is basically a very, very good person with a big heart that does a lot of things, 90% of which nobody knows about. We stay in touch every day. So just as a side note, we get to hear a lot in the press about Trump cheaping out on something or this, that, and the other. But, you know, here we got somebody saying there's a lot that Trump did with no publicity, and he wasn't seeking really.
Yes, and by the way, I've heard these stories personally through friends of friends who he would pay for cancer operations, for the fathers of people he was working that were working for him, who didn't have the money. I mean, when you hear these stories from the lips of real people, you know this guy is generous, but he doesn't advertise it. He does not advertise it.
And this is a guy who usually advertises his name a lot, and he wants his name on everything and the brand, and so people only know one aspect of Trump, you know, the self-marketing, which is kind of necessary to establish a brand anyway. So the author of the book, who is quoting this Mr. Karlstrom from the FBI, the author, Craig Unger, he doesn't like that angle. He doesn't like the idea of Trump also being generous, Trump, you know, helping people out. You know, Unger, the author Unger doesn't like that at all. So, book continues with this. It says here, Trump being Trump, loyalty and generosity came with strings attached. Trump cultivated FBI people. Investigative reporter Jeff Stein, editor of Spy Talk, says in the publication An American Affair, or maybe it's a book, and that's well known behavior by people who swim in dangerous waters. They want to have a get-out-of-jail card, and that get-out-of-jail is having friendships or being a good source for the FBI. Karlstrom insisted that Trump was not an FBI informant, but another agent told Stein that Trump was known within the Bureau as a hip pocket source, that is, someone who was not officially a source and therefore not in the FBI files, but who had curried enough favor to be known as a friend. And then the book goes into, you know, some of the Trump business, business with David Bogatin, Bogatin buying luxury condos to launder money, a connection to Mr. Kislin, and that sort of stuff. So basically, we only get this negative angle in the book, this insinuation that Trump was buying favors. Trump was buying his way into the FBI as sort of a get-out-of-jail-free card, and he may have been an unofficial source.
That he really isn't generous, which, by the way, I know for a fact that he really is, because he's helped people that could not possibly ever do him a favor in return of that kind.
And that's key. That's key to understand, right? So. Supposedly, he bought his way into the FBI. He cultivated supposedly fake friendships, and he was an unofficial source for the Bureau just to get something out of it. But what about a positive interpretation? A positive interpretation of sometimes being an unofficial source, you know, talking to people like Mr. Karlstrom and others.
And of course, that would place Trump's trips to Russia and
Yeah.
his activities on a different. Is Trump cooperating
Completely
with?
different.
Was he cooperating in a way that was helping U.S. counterintelligence
Yes.
track what the Russians were doing? Right?
Exactly. And so, I mean, imagine I said this on my German show many years ago. I said, just hypothetically, just imagine a conversation, a very shielded conversation between Donald Trump and let's say somebody like Mr. Kallstrom from the FBI or somebody of that caliber, right? They talk about some of the Trump business and maybe this security person working from the government. This person might say to Trump, listen, if you have some Russian business contacts, right? So you meet with them, or they fly over to some place and they stay at one of your places or whatever. If you get some of these contacts, the FBI might get involved and look at these Russian people and maybe make something out of it. Whatever the result may be, something useful for the United States, for the security of the United States. And Donald would not even have to be keyed into many details. It's always best if things are compartmented. And I told people, just imagine that conversation. Okay, you may do some Russian business. The FBI may or may not. The FBI may or may not use this as an opportunity to maybe talk to these Russians or approach them in some way and maybe get something useful out of it, right? And for that matter, if Trump cultivated a certain image, being friendly with the Russians or being neutral with the Russians or whatever, by cultivating that image, that would make things easier, right? And I always said that, why hasn't anybody ever mentioned a positive spin, when it comes to Trump's contacts with Bogatin?
And by the way, there's always this question with spies. Which side do they work for, or agents in politics? There's a biography of Bill Clinton that's rather odd, that many years ago, that claimed that Clinton went to Moscow in December of 1969, went to Prague in January 1970, was behind the Iron Curtain. He was this Rhodes Scholar. And there's this really weird claim that as an anti-war activist, as a leftist, Clinton had been working with U.S. intelligence, with the CIA abroad. This is a claim. So that raises the question of, for those of us that followed Clinton's career and saw his connections with the left, is like, wait a minute, was he an infiltrator? Was he infiltrating the communist side, pretending to be this leftist guy to be recruited by the Czech intelligence in January 1970? I mean, what's really interesting about all these questions is when you look back on the post-Cold War era, and we are in a bit of trouble now, somehow that we haven't been wiped out yet. Somehow the Russians keep stumbling, the Chinese keep stumbling. So you have to ask the question, is there a level of counterintelligence in the West that's operating through these captured politicians, feeding the Russians the idea that they're going to get everything they want, and it keeps, every time the Russians get close to getting everything they want, it goes further and further away from them and the Chinese. I mean, is that possible?
Yeah.
It's wishful thinking on my part, right? What is it?
It's like when you try something like what I hypothetically just mentioned, right? You want to have somebody like Donald Trump being involved in doing something useful for national security. It's kept off the books because we know the FBI had been infiltrated over and over again, especially before some of the moles were discovered, like Robert Hansen. So you keep somebody off the books. When the Russians, of course, they have to assume that or the Russians always had to assume that Trump had contacts, or they knew that Trump had contacts with the FBI, and that Trump would likely sometimes talk to the FBI about this, that, or the other, right? This is a kind of a careful. These are careful, waters to tread, and so you cannot. You cannot be as unprofessional as I find this author here, and always pick the negative scenario and not look at the other scenarios. He also mentions at the time the United Nations, back then especially the United Nations with its big building in New York, right? The United Nations was a paradise for spies, a true oasis, because diplomatic cover gave the KGB free run of the place, thanks to United Nations rules that ban CIA and FBI personnel from the premises. Blah, blah, blah. In 1979, former UN Undersecretary Arkady Shevchenko, high-ranking Soviet diplomat who defected to the West, confirmed that as many as 300 KGB officers were stationed in New York. But of course, if you have the United Nations there in New York, it's also a great magnet to draw in all of these KGB guys, right? And then maybe American intelligence can make something out of that, right? I mean, there's so many opportunities there, and it's like we have to look at this from a broader perspective. I mean, when you've dealt long enough with intelligence topics, there's great disappointments, there's great failures where you can learn a lot from, but there's also success stories, and there are successes that we will likely never hear about, or maybe we will hear about some successes in 20 years.
Yeah, for the listeners, the book that I referred to was Partners in Power, the Clintons and Their America, written by Roger Morris, who's a history professor at the University of New Mexico, and this book came out in the 90s. And it basically, the allegation was there had been some records purged from the CIA, which involved something called Operation Chaos, in which the CIA recruited college students to be agent provocateurs, and supposedly Bill Clinton was on a list of these recruited agent provocateurs by the CIA. And so that the book alleges that when Clinton traveled to Moscow and Prague in 1969 and 70, that he was actually a recruited CIA agent, which is now it's one source. And, I don't know Mr. Morris, how good a historian he was. He had been, to give his background, he had been a former Foreign Service officer and a national security aide to President Johnson and President Nixon. But Morris was opposed to the Vietnam War. So he wrote a biography of Nixon, by the way, as well. So Morris had his point of view. This is very interesting that a American leftist professor would write this in his research and say, wait a minute, Bill Clinton isn't one of us.
Yeah.
He's one of them.
Yeah.
Intriguing, doesn't prove anything. It's because I'm not sure how that CIA record, how intact that record is he's operating from. He's making a claim about a record that was purged. So I don't really understand the source. But this just gives you an example of the ambiguity of looking at these people. And of course, this would raise the question about, I think Clinton's wife, Hillary, would she be the same thing?
Mm. Yeah. Also,
a Goldwater girl become a communist, become a, it's weird. It's very weird. And so exactly to your point. So when we look at Donald Trump, though, we don't find nearly as many incriminating points in his background as we do with the Clintons.
Yeah, and
right?
also when
I mean,
you
it's
talk
just
about
not. It's just there's no there.
when we talk about
There's interesting people build a circumstantial case, but it's very weak.
yeah, I mean you can write a book like American Compromat, and it's got all these pages and it got all these bits and names being dropped, and just somebody may go away from this book and think, well, this seems like an open and shut case, but you could spend even more pages on a case and still be off.
And the same thing with the book Putin's People. I mean, it has the same. It takes more of the connections with Russians and certain Russians and organized crime and Russian intelligence through Trump's business. It takes that as the thing.
I mean, when
but we can't as civilians without access to the secret files and what was going on. We can't really tell.
Yeah, and with Belton's book, I mean, Catherine Belton was really brave when she put out that book, and she named some of these names, and they tried to sue her.
Yeah, she did.
Especially in Britain, when it's really easy when you have the money to sue somebody into oblivion for defamation or whatever. But her book is an important piece of work, but I don't think she is specialized enough when it comes to intelligence to give that broader perspective, because
by the way, that is the trouble with most journalistic reporting on espionage, is that the problem with journalism, and it's also a problem with academics, their knowledge of this business and its history and their ability to think strategically through the problem is usually not adequate. Because you need a high level of analytical ability to realize the problems of figuring things out.
Yeah. And I mentioned because the same aspects that I just talked about with with Trump and this contact and that contact, the same applies to some of the people or things being mentioned in Catherine Belton's book, Putin's People, right? Of course, it was horrendous to see KGB money flowing into the city of London, and these Russians moving to London and their kids driving sports cars in the city of London and getting involved in all kinds of things. And a
KGB general, buying soccer teams?
Yeah, exactly. And Roman Abramovich and all these guys. Of course, that was horrendous to watch. And I've been talking about this for a very, very long time, even before most people realized how that this is actually important, right? I mean, I remember the time 15 years ago, 20 years ago, when people said, "Why are you talking about this in the first place? Why do you care?" And when I covered these things, I mean, now we know, of course, with new information like presented in Catherine Belton's book, we know that guys like KGB leaders like Andropov, they put together a special team, recruited as KGB people like Putin for that specific team, and they had to rebuild or rechange Russia and spread all that KGB money internationally. And the KGB also had these experts on Western economy. They knew how it functioned. They knew where the tax havens are and all that. I understand.
And
that.
They had Robert Maxwell.
Yeah.
Setting up front companies for the KGB, for the Soviets to move at the end of the Cold War all this KGB money and Communist Party money into the United States to buy up other entities to create.
Yeah.
I mean, I forget the number of front companies he set up before his death in the United States.
Yeah,
he was like,
Maxwell reminded me of Willy Münzenberg, this publishing empire that it was losing money, always losing money, but it kept going and going and going. Money. So I was always covering these things for 20 years, and I said that this is going in a terrible direction. This has all kinds of risks associated with it, but still, when you look at some of these decisions that were made by the British, for example, just like with the Americans. But, still, when you let KGB money, and it's KGB money, when you let that into the city of London, when you let these Russians into London, you got them in London. they are away from Russia. It's not like in the old days where you had to carefully cultivate one source in Russia, or you maybe catch some important Russian guy on a foreign trip and you can maybe approach him. Now you can lure these Russians out. You can lure the Russians out into London, and they have their family there. The sons and daughters are driving around in sports cars. You can approach them. Intelligence can approach them. So it just means that something that may seem in a certain way, there's so many possibilities behind it. There's so many permutations, variations. There's like 10 major scenarios, and each scenario is divided up into 100 sub-scenarios. And so that's what people have to keep in mind when we talk about these things. Sometimes a decision is made by an actual mole. Sometimes there's a double agent at play, right? And sometimes, like with Maxwell, the Israelis did this whole song and dance when he died, like he was like the greatest hero to Israel. But we don't know why Israel did that. Because they really loved the guy, or because they wanted to maintain a certain impression. This may have been a ruse by Israeli intelligence, just to not give away how much they actually knew about Robert Maxwell and his Russian connections. And
Ghislaine Maxwell's connections to that whole pedophile ring, that of Jeffrey Epstein.
Yeah, and sometimes in the intelligence business, you have to take risks. You have to get your hands dirty, and you have to let things play out to a degree, because the stakes are so high. And so I learned over the years how to present these cases, and how to remind the audience of the complexity of it all. And it's perfectly okay, and it's very professional to sometimes say we don't have a conclusion yet about this particular aspect, or we're still working on it, or we have some good ideas, several of them. We're not just going with one that seems to serve our ideological purpose. That's the nature of intelligence, right? And Trump is supposed to be hard to read. That's what Kellogg said. The special envoy, General Kellogg, he said this in April of 2024.
Now here's an interesting aspect, which goes to what Ukrainian intelligence has suggested, is that when the left in the United States is claiming that Trump is a Russian puppet, still saying that he has cut off Ukrainian military aid, and you have oh no, the aid's still coming to us. And then what I heard yesterday from a reliable source is that Trump has made a secret deal with Ukraine to get all of Ukraine has rare earth minerals, right? Lithium. Special minerals in Ukraine. And that Trump has made a deal for America to get those minerals in exchange for us pumping Ukraine full of ammunition and military supplies.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, now that's what's going on behind the scenes. So you got two rumors. You get the rumor that Trump is going to sell out Ukraine, which is being, it's Russian and left-wing sources saying Trump's a Russian agent. And then you've got these other sources that, oh no, he's got a secret deal with Ukraine. And I should mention this source that told me that Putin has had open heart surgery, a valve replacement, that the Russians have been planning and are planning imminently to move on the Savaki Gap, that there's going to be an increase in the danger, that there's going to be a direct confrontation coming before Easter between Russia and their Belarusian, puppet, Lukashenko, and NATO, and that they've moved all these anti-aircraft missiles, and they're moving troops, and they're preparing to threaten NATO directly with nuclear attack. So, which means that if a nuke is launched from Belarus, it's Belarus that gets the nuke back, right? Not Russia. So Russia becomes and of course, this is exactly the tactic you would expect from Mr. Putin, from the Kremlin, to really frighten everybody in the West, to scare them so badly that they'll rush to the table and they'll give Russia what it wants, which is what Russia wants is the Ukrainian government in exile, elections on Russian terms where they can manufacture the votes to create the Ukrainian government they want and to get the whole thing, get all of Ukraine.
Yeah.
And that, but I think if what you mentioned, what Kellogg has said about we haven't supported Ukraine the way it's been told, that Ukraine has really done a heroic thing holding on their own, and that the Russia only has sanctions on a scale of 3 out of 10, right?
Yeah.
That we can ratchet that up and we can crush the Russians now. I think what I'm hearing is that Trump knows that he's got Putin under his thumb, and the Russian military problems haven't been straightened out. That Russia's desperately mobilizing more troops and resources, and that nuclear war is maybe their only way out, and that is that a way out? Do you know they just fired the Russian official in charge of the rocket launches because of all the failures of the Russian rockets, which is like, that's what their nukes are delivered by is missiles, rockets, large missiles. They've had all these missile failures. And it's like, wait a minute. It looks like with this failure that happened a few months ago where the ICBM blew up in the silo, and really, I mean, you look at the picture of it, it's catastrophic, right? And you think, is their nuclear arsenal reliable? And did they just discover, and are they having real tests rather than the tests are doctored so they know they're going to succeed? It's not a true test. And were they cheating on the test, and then the whole thing is just a rotten barrel of apples? Is this what they just discovered?
Yeah, there was a recent report, and it ties into previous reports, especially since 2022. It talks about the Ukrainian expertise about Russian rockets, because the Ukrainian industry that had been built up during the Cold War. Ukraine used to be all about farming, then it became more tech and more tech and more tech, and then the Russians...
And the Ukrainian rocket engineers were the core of the Soviet rocket force.
And so you had like a million plus people, Ukrainians, who are experts in all the bits and pieces necessary for the Russian military. This was also a reason for the invasion. I kept saying this from the very start. I even said that before the invasion. All the things that the Russians need from Ukraine or in Ukraine. And so there were these missiles being partially developed and partially built in Ukraine, then shipped to Russia. Then they was servicing of these missiles. So the Russians would ship their missiles to Ukraine for expert servicing. Then they would be shipped back. And when the invasion happened, there was even talk of Ukrainian threats. They said, we got all the plans, we got all the people that know how to make this. Maybe we will share all this information with NATO, all the detailed drawings, stuff that the Russians even don't have because they're incompetent. The Russians don't have all this, all the blueprints and the servicing manuals and the the Russians don't have that for their own systems. And so there's the problem is so many Russians are drunks in their system, and the Ukrainians don't share some of these characteristics of the depressiveness. And some people attribute it to the poor soil and the bad weather in Russia. But there's a darkness, Muscovy, they call them orcs, right? That's the slur against the Russians that the Ukrainians call the Russian troops orcs. There is something that Ukraine has been such a vital part of the Russian technological sphere. And now we're looking at 10 years, more than 10 years now, since basically fighting between Ukraine and Russia started in Donbass in 2014, the annexation of Crimea. It's 10 years where the Ukrainians aren't servicing the Russian rocket forces anymore. Right? And so and I want to emphasize that's an if Donald Trump had indeed deliberately confused the Russians for decades, right? If Trump had been doing that for decades, that would now pay off in a big way. People should be aware of that, because it's not just because of all the contacts that Trump had over decades, with the people named in this book, Kislin and Bogatin and this, that, and the other. Because if Trump had limited contact with these people and some business dealings, these Russians, these influential Russians, they're part of this bigger Russian discussion in the higher levels of the Russian system. So So the Russians are going in circles, possibly. They're debating what to make out of it. The confusion is even bigger because some of these Russians, they may be telling Putin, as far as I know, Trump likes us, spend some time with him, and the other guy is saying the same thing. This guy is saying, we're all saying the same thing. Trump seems like someone who likes us. And so maybe that's now creating an even bigger confusion because of all that long history that Trump had dealing with, many, many people. And you mentioned the natural resources of Ukraine, kind of an exchange, Ukrainian resources for the United States, military aid, then goes back. It's especially about lithium, and it says this: the Geological Service said Ukraine has one of Europe's largest confirmed reserves, estimated at 500,000 metric tons of lithium, vital for batteries and others. And it's important for America going into the future, because so far China is dominating lithium because they can mine it by disregarding any safety standards for the workers.
And they've gone into Latin America after the lithium mines.
So Western controlled or Western owned lithium mines, they had been closed down a long time ago because the Chinese stuff was cheaper, because they don't care about the environment, they don't care about their workers. And so that's why there was such a dominance of Chinese lithium, which became a problem for the United States. But if now, there's like this new option there, Ukrainian lithium, that can change the global dynamic significantly of having access to these minerals. And it's not just batteries. Lithium is hyper important, absolutely hyper important. That's why the Chinese had tried to dominate this.
Yeah, and that's just one of the minerals that you can get out of Ukraine. But it's so Ukraine, and then of course it's the vulnerability of Russia and China and their economic failure in this financial sphere. They're trying to create an alternative to the dollar by using BRICS, by flipping all these third world countries, by getting control of these resources, mineral resources and oil. Look at Venezuela, look at the Middle East. They're trying to get control of that. And of course, they've got the sub-Saharan African minerals nailed down. But the problem is, with all of this, they can't seem to get at the dollar. Every time they try to get at it, it backfires. And here's Trump applying these sanctions. And this is another thing people are saying about Trump, and we should discuss this on the trade issue, that Trump is destroying the Western alliance. He's going to destroy NATO because he's threatening different countries.
It's bigger now.
With sanctions.
NATO is bigger now. NATO is bigger now.
NATO is bigger now. And what's interesting, and then the dispute over Denmark, over Greenland, supposed dispute, and the anger in Canada about referring to Canada as a future, addition to the United States. I see this ambiguously, because now you have Mexico and Canada caving in to Trump's demands, and now the United States is acquiring greater influence over the trade system, is reasserting its ascendancy over the trade system, which has security implications. Rather than breaking up NATO, this may in the end serve a restructuring function that counteracts Russia's BRICS strategy, Russia and China's BRICS strategy. Maybe I'm looking at this and thinking, there's method in this madness. And so, what do you think? I mean, what are you hearing in Europe? People are griping about Trump, and they're making these claims about him being bad. But how is it really playing
Well,
out?
the Europeans have turned it into sort of a silly hobby to talk trash about the United States. It's like a silly hobby. It's like a weird, counterproductive, therapeutical exercise for Europeans to just talk trash
And
about the United
Canada's
States.
going through this now too, by the way.
At the same time, I think knowledge about the United States, general knowledge about the United States, has never been lower in Europe, right? I mean, besides headlines, oh, Trump said something, blah 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 blah. What do Europeans actually know about the United States, right? I mean, you ask, especially young people, even the young people who go to the best schools, supposedly best education and all that, or you watch government-funded television, or you watch some of the other big channels on television, what do you actually get to know about the United States? And that's just very little. And it's kind of this revolving, ever-evolving thing when Europeans, they talk trash about America, but then they secretly kind of like they always want America to be there. They always want America to be a guiding force. They want America to do the right thing and take on the responsibility that Europe can take on, because it's just like this patchwork of different countries, and it's very much about style over here, and nobody quite knows here what a republic is or what a republic is supposed to be. I mean, people talk trash about American democracy or the American republic all day long here, but look at Europe as a comparison. What do we got here? I mean, Britain is still officially a monarchy. Britain has a lot of problems. It's a multicultural weirdo island at this point, and people are now kind of waking up. Okay, maybe we should have a real country. France, they can't decide. Do they want to be another failed socialist experiment, or do they still want to be an empire, a traditional one? Or maybe they can finally figure out what a republic is supposed to be like. Germany is of course a dumpster fire of epic proportions, because everybody's so confused and we're so infiltrated. What else do you got? Austria, supposedly neutral, in Russia's pocket.
Well, you got Italy with Maloney.
Yeah. I mean, Italy is
and you've got the Scandinavian countries, but of course, Italy's not committing to expand its military, at least not yet.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. So it's like it's not that impressive what's going on here, and there's a secret envy. I think deep down everybody knows it here in Europe. There's this deep-seated envy here about the United States. In secret, they envy America, because still Americans get along. Despite all the blah 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 in the media, and whites hating blacks supposedly, and blacks hating whites, and all that. Americans have gotten along with each other for a very long time, and they've created all these businesses, and they come up with new innovations all the time, and so there's like this secret envy here. And when Trump became president for the first time, he seemed like, and to Europeans, he seemed like a caricature. To the Russians, he seemed like a caricature, and that may have been playing into Trump's favor, and just being seeming unpredictable to the world, and being hard to read, because sometimes he behaved like a caricature, which is necessary to build a brand like this, and to just have all these activities going on. Sometimes you have to play a role. You have to be the marketer. You have to market yourself. You have to market your brand. But now, when General Kellogg really put it bluntly when he recently said that there's a whole groups that is coming up with a strategy for Ukraine and the Russians and the Chinese. It's like these well-established experts. And it's the same kind of experts that managed things during World War II. It's the same kind of group of experts that have managed things for so long and gotten us through one major crisis after another, right? And that's kind of an important point that Kellogg just made. Should we get into, as a comparison, should we now get maybe into the other examples, the other cases, the other people like Alger Hiss, Felix Frankfurter, the Supreme Court judge who loved the Soviet Union apparently, and the spy around John F. Kennedy, which some people have deducted must have been California Senator John Tunney, right? Look at these people. I mean, I mentioned Alger Hiss, or we mentioned Alger Hiss in the beginning of the show.
I would not, Tunney could be a person influenced by the Russians. He wasn't a very smart guy, Tunney, if you followed him. And I lived in California when he was a senator and afterwards. And he used to debate Bruce Herschelson on ABC television in the Los Angeles, Orange County area. And not impressive. Herschelson wiped the floor with him every night that they debated on ABC television. Tunney just wasn't that bright, and he would get caught in these things. No, I think the candidate for being the spy near Kennedy was Walt Rostow, who ultimately became National Security Advisor for Lyndon Johnson. And there was a huge, I guess you could say, scandal because the head of security for the State Department was denying Walt Rostow, among some other people, a security clearance because Walt Rostow's family background came from it's a Russian name, sort of Bolshevik people, and that there was reasons to be really worried about Rostow's background. And so this was Bobby Kennedy and John Kennedy got really angry that this was being blocked. And of course, they famously went after the State Department security guy. So I'll put in for Walt Rostow being the spy in the Kennedy administration. Of course, there must have been others because the Kennedys, they let in a lot of people that they shouldn't have let in back into the government.
Yeah, and just so people remember, I mean, Kennedy at the time was considered left. I mean, if Kennedy was alive today, the left would consider him to be right-wing or super right-wing, right? I mean, this was a different...
By the way, he went to the right of the Eisenhower administration when running for president in 1960. Eisenhower did a number of things that Kennedy considered was soft on Soviet communism. If you go to the Democratic Convention in 1960 that nominated JFK was in Los Angeles, and I think if you go on YouTube, you can listen to his speech, his acceptance speech for the nomination. A brilliant speech and very anti-Soviet, very anti-communist, very Cold War, very Churchillian, right? Very much like Winston Churchill. And he wanted civil defense. Eisenhower backed away from it. He wanted certain things that the Gaither Committee report had recommended to strengthen us against the Soviets. And of course, so he was not, and of course, when he got to be president, he had all these leftists in his administration. And so he didn't, and then he was assassinated in November 1963. So we don't know where that would have gone. Was he really moving left? Like the left likes to claim, that he was going to get us out of Vietnam. I mean, he certainly got us more into Vietnam when he was president objectively. And this claim, there's a new claim, by the way, by this Kennedy assassination people. There's been a number of these new researchers that are claiming that, no, it wasn't the CIA that killed Kennedy. It was the American generals because he was going to move us out of the Vietnam War. And it's like, you got to understand how absurd this is because American generals aren't political,
Yeah.
And Maxwell Taylor, you go to these people. I think Maxwell Taylor was the Kennedy's favorite general. Look, when Maxwell Taylor went to Vietnam and came back, he was saying, we need to help him more.
Yeah.
Right.
So sometimes you can't really, from a Soviet intelligence perspective, you can't really get certain people. You can't really control them. But what you can do is you try to bring Mole's assets closer and closer to the target person. And there, I mean, people still make a big deal out of the Bay of Pigs invasion, right? And and that sort of thing. And we still don't know exactly who may have sabotaged the operation. With the maps were terrible and outdated, and they didn't really, the swampy or whatever territory wasn't really understood that well when the operation was planned.
And by the way, classically within American politics, Kennedy is blamed for not going through with the air power support. Yeah. But there's some military experts who think that even that air power support wasn't going to save the situation, because the Cubans had known, the Cuban communists knew Castro's forces were there. They were basically caught on the beach. They were outnumbered. They couldn't possibly advance. So it wasn't going to be a success. And of course, Allen Dulles, the head of the CIA for years, and of course, Nixon as vice president was sitting on that panel that helped organize the Bay of Pigs. And it was passed by Vice President Nixon onto the Kennedy administration. And the mistake that the Kennedy administration made is that they assumed these people were competent at the CIA.
Yeah.
They assumed that they knew what they were doing. Yeah, and so it really was inherited. Kennedy inherited the Bay of Pigs operation from the Eisenhower-Nixon administration. And really, that is something that's important to know. And when it failed, Kennedy was like, I don't know what I'm getting into here. Yeah. And he was cautious when it came to military operations and clandestine things. Kennedy had a cautious side, like at the Cuban Missile Crisis, that kind of saved him from grief. So arguments could be made either way, but Allen Dulles was fired. And according to Joseph Trento's Secret History of the CIA, basically the Kennedy brothers didn't trust anybody, put their own guy in, one of their own friends in there as head of the CIA. And then Bobby Kennedy, as Attorney General, was really sort of micromanaging or from the side managing the CIA, right?
Exactly.
This is the claim.
Yeah, and so the more bureaucrats you have, the bigger the haystack is, and so it's harder to find the needle in the haystack. And that's why it's so interesting to see now Elon Musk pushing for just tightening down government, making it smaller, less people, less crammed, more oversight,
and basically cut down on the graft and the waste.
Yeah,
because there's something going on. We're leaking money.
Yeah,
like this Ukraine thing. How does $100 billion going to Ukraine disappear on the American side? Where did it go?
When you have more bureaucracy and bureaucrats and the haystack is bigger, there's more assets, more likely, and every individual mole, they can slow things down a little bit more, or they can confuse things a little bit more. So it's even harder to catch these moles when they screw something up. And by limiting the number of people involved, it makes it harder for especially Russian intelligence and Chinese intelligence to be so active. And it's the same that we talked about with Trump. Same questions and issues apply to Elon Musk. Now Elon Musk has been to China because of the lithium. Now there's other sources. Elon, he let some of the crazies talk a lot on X or Twitter as it was known. He let them talk a bunch of stuff, and so people started to wildly interpret what Elon was doing, coming to all sorts of grandiose conclusions. But the fact of the matter is that Elon is also very hard to read, and we can't just have a quick reflex interpretation of Elon's activities and then draw conclusions from that. So,
the same thing, by the way, for Tulsi Gabbard.
Yeah.
Because I find it interesting in the hearings. It came out that, of course, she's a lieutenant colonel in the Army. She still commands a battalion in the reserves. That it came out that she was assigned to a psychological warfare unit.
Yeah.
Right? And it's like, wait a minute, scratch my head. She becomes involved in politics. She poses as a left-wing person, or she was in the Army, and she's suddenly moving to the right. Is she a bad person moving to the right, or is she engaged in some kind of psychological warfare thing that she's working with Army intelligence with.
Sure.
Even, I mean,
Sure.
I mean, it's technically illegal, right, for the Army to be engaged in political activity.
Yeah.
But
And now she has this
these lines
profile.
are ambiguous, and we're talking about the national security, and we're talking about real Russian infiltration of our politics and Chinese infiltration. And is there, in this secret war, and we know that the CIA, we know from the Church Committee back in the 1970s that the CIA broke all kinds of rules, technically, to fight the Soviets, and the CIA was scaled back. But the people on the left, they were always going, they're still not right. The CIA is still against us. And of course, there's this element of corruption. And you have James Angleton the whole time arguing, we have to have counterintelligence.
Yeah.
We can't, we have to be allowed to break certain rules. I mean, he actually was sort of making these arguments, and you could see it leaking through in some of his interview he gave with the BBC, interviews he gave with Edward J. Epstein, who is, I think, the best intelligence journalist and political scientist out there, wrote a brilliant book on Edward Snowden, brilliant book on Angleton and Golitsyn. So this is not an easy thing to read. How does Tulsi Gabbard this is interesting. How does she get appointed when you think she's going to be shot down? There's not going to be enough votes for this person. And she gets through?
Yeah.
She gets through the Senate Intelligence Committee. And this is not, there's something, when I kind of realized, I think maybe I mentioned this before, I had an epiphany. Wait a minute. If she's really not as she appears, if her history is not straightforward, she's going to get passed. She's going to get through. Because otherwise she shouldn't. She shouldn't have passed that committee. But she passed it. So I'm thinking, oh my gosh.
Yeah, I mean,
what's the real story here?
The sheer volume of known, documented Soviet intelligence operations, and the veracity of it, and the nature of these operations. I mean, all of the effort that was made by the Soviets, that also kind of made the Soviets predictable to a degree. In some ways, because we know what they go after. We know what their profiling is like. Who they go after, what somebody has to say for the Russians to become interested, and at what point the Russians will trust somebody more. How many bits and pieces need to happen for the Russians to take the next step?
Who is the United States going to recruit as a counterintelligence asset against the Russians, except somebody who has connections and relatives and looks like an ideal Soviet agent? And here's the thing, our friend Trevor Loudon has a thing on Tulsi Gabbard that makes her look like a communist asset. A very suspicious, at least it's a circumstantial case that he makes against her, and it's scary.
It has to be done. I mean, the case has to be. This angle has to be covered as well. I mean, this is not like we're not the Politburo deciding what case is solved and what case is not solved, other than cases that have actually been solved, but. This is an of course,
Trevor says that it's Occam's razor. It's the simplest explanation. She's just working for Moscow and Beijing the whole time. And it's very interesting though. Get this detail in the hearings. I don't know if you watched Tulsi Gabbard's hearings. It's very strange. Question after question, senator after senator, will you denounce Edward Snowden as a traitor? Mm-hmm. And she wouldn't do it. She said, Edward Snowden broke the law. Edward Snowden broke the law. Fourth Amendment, we need to prevent our own intelligence services from being used against the American people. And it's very interesting. And then they said, well, you had sponsored this legislation to give Edward Snowden a pardon, essentially. But that legislation never had a chance of passing.
Yeah.
And of course, she must have known that when she sponsored it.
So what did she get out of it? Yeah, that's an interesting question.
Right. Why did she? And then Edward Snowden, now this is the detail that really got to me. Edward Snowden publicly told Tulsi Gabbard to denounce him as a traitor, basically. He publicly said, denounce me as a traitor, which he is. I think we all can object. I mean, you look at Edward J. Epstein's book on Snowden is absolutely brilliant. It's the last super brilliant thing he did. Wow, the attention to detail, and wow, how it frames the Edward Snowden story in a way that you have to really strongly believe that he was recruited by the Russians long before his defection to Russia. So Tulsi Gabbard being told to denounce him as a traitor, and she won't do it, even though he told her, go ahead and denounce me, it's no big deal, and she wouldn't do it. Wow. Why?
Yeah, and especially
what kind of is that a double message?
And especially when you have a military background, especially when you have some sort of an intelligence, especially psychological warfare background, that changes your whole view on any sort of recruitment by foreign powers, right? Because
now,
I mean, I noticed that. Because I noticed that over the years when some people, I mean, especially in Europe, right, complete morons when it comes to very important things, very uneducated, very arrogant. Some of these people, they likely have been recruited by Russian intelligence, and the Russians were starting to wonder, these people are really astoundingly stupid. This is not like in the old days when you had some smart people and you had to be careful in your recruitment process. But not everybody is stupid these days, and so people with a background, they know how miserable it can be to be recruited by a foreign power, how dangerous it is, how it can all come crashing down. You spend the rest of your life in a supermax prison. Because if you have the background knowledge, you've read about some of these cases that went south for Soviet intelligence eventually, and we know about Soviet molds that were in the West that were completely miserable. I mean, the British guys that were becoming alcoholics and completely stressed out 24 hours of the day. They would get nightmares from this. They felt the walls closing in, and the only option that they had was an exfiltration plan. They weren't even sure it was going to work, leaving behind family, destroying the family names, ruining the lives of your family members when you just disappear. It's not pretty, and I mean, Tulsi Gabbard must know it's not pretty, and some other people must know it is absolutely not pretty. And the failures, I mean, even the smaller failures of Soviet intelligence, when they can protect you, when they can warn you in time.
Yeah. Before we drift too far afield, to keep us back focused on Gabbard's testimony and this ambiguity thing, as her going in DNI, there's this other issue that's connected, and that is, and of course I cite the New Republic's story, Trump's buyout purge comes for the CIA. It's really interesting. Trump's buyout offer, that is, agree with me or leave. I mean, basically they're saying, all right, we'll give you severance pay and we'll give you all this money and you leave. But if there's something wrong with you, we're going to axe you and you aren't going to get that. In other words, threatening them. And of course, I think it was U.S. Senator Tim Kaine who told the Wall Street Journal that, that's not even legal. Trump can't do this. But really, you can. There's nothing illegal about the president saying, you know what, we're going to go after you. You leftists in the CIA, you people who have distorted everything. If there's something wrong that you've done in the past, we're going to get you. So take this deal now and go, which is what saves the headache of the legal battle of getting them out. Because of course, there's federal employees have these protections, including CIA, which they shouldn't have, by the way. The CIA people should be able to be fired like that. on a drop of a dime just for being suspected. But the reason this is interesting is that if you go because Gabbard's going to be sitting on top of this thing, not just of the CIA, but the NSA. She's going to be overseeing DIA. All of the intelligence agencies are going to be, she's going to have this oversight. And what does she say talking about Snowden? Why won't she denounce Snowden as a traitor? Because it's a signal to the people who have committed treason. Let's make a deal. I mean, that's a thought that goes through my mind. And the Fourth Amendment, what's that about? If you're a mole in the DIA, CIA, NSA, what have you been doing? Mm-hmm. You've been spying on Americans using American technology. That's what you've been doing. You've had access to these databases and computers, and you have been passing that information to Russia on America. So you've been spying on them. So what have you done? You've broken the Fourth Amendment as an employee, right? Because you're really a mole. And if they go back and they look at these computer records, if they do audits, are they going to find these people out? And these people in the back of their mind, they're thinking, did I leave a trail? Am I going to be exposed? Right?
Just take the money and run.
Right. And they can, take the money and run. Here, the administration's giving you an offer. Quit now. We don't investigate you. You leave. We get rid of you. Yes. Good riddance. But if you stay, we're going to find out what you've been doing. And by the way, Tulsi Gabbard is saying whistleblowers are going to be protected. Come directly to me. She says this, I have a plan. She said this over and over again when Snowden came up. Right. I have a plan. There won't be another Edward Snowden. There won't be another one. So if she denounced him as a traitor, she's saying these guys that come forward could end up in jail. But she's saying, no, you're going to be protected.
Come to
me.
My door is always open.
Yeah, my door is always open. Tell me the truth. Right? No, I mean, I'm watching this and I'm thinking, oh crap, this is good strategy. So I'm thinking, no, she got by the committee because they talked to these intelligence committee guys and they said, look, guys, we got a mole problem. The Russians are in there. We got to get them out. And wow, I'm looking at this a little differently. It's very subtle. You have to look at it in a different eye. And the thing is what if Tulsi Gabbard, she comes up through this weird family. She's a Hindu. Maybe there were, like Trevor says, there's all these problems. Army intelligence comes to her and recruits her as a double agent.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
A long time ago, you got to play this certain role. And so it's like, because how is she getting this position again now? Why is her? I mean, you would never think. You think when you heard about the nomination, I thought that doesn't make any sense, right? Mm-hmm. But now I'm thinking, ooh, maybe it makes sense. And so I Trevor's great. I appreciate it. He may be right. Maybe Occam's razor. I'm not a believer in Occam's razor, by the way, because as you know, and you look at intelligence things, the simplest explanation is almost never the right one, right? Yes. The obvious explanation is like, it wouldn't be good intelligence tradecraft or strategy if it was the obvious explanation. You have to tangle everything up. You have to reverse and inverse, and you've got to make it so confusing that it's the wilderness of mirrors is not a place where Occam's razor works. Or it wouldn't be the wilderness of mirrors.
Yeah, I mean, if you apply a specific set of analytical factors, and you say, okay, you're looking for people meeting with certain people, right? And you meet with some guy, and he's attached to this Russian oligarch, Konstantin Malofeyev, who's been funding all this stuff in Ukraine even many years ago, and Malofeyev is tied into the new right wing and the Dugin people, and they've recruited people over here in Germany. You look at connections like this, and you look at certain statements. Where does Tulsi Gabbard, for example, stand on this topic, that, and the other? In many cases, you will get to a good point. You will come to a conclusion that this person is not worth the risk. you eliminate that person from a possible position, or you investigate further, and then you strike gold, you find some super incriminating evidence. These are all different approaches that have to be used, and you will always, as you and I do all the time, we have to look at these contacts. We have to look at, has somebody taken money from the Russians? What is this person's ideology? But yeah, there's so many permutations. There's so many. It's like playing chess. You have to consider somebody is planning this a few steps ahead. This combination or this move leads to X amount of other possible moves, and that every one of those moves leads to another number of possible moves. And so this is why intelligence people, they talk about these cases and they compare notes and they compare opinions, and because nobody can get everything. Nobody can nail every case, and that's why communication plays such an important role, and that's why communication has been sabotaged so much. If you look at how people talk about these cases sometimes, too much emotion and too much ideology and or wishful thinking, or always negative thinking, always picking the worst possible scenario, personal attacks, or if somebody doesn't agree with you, you call them an asset or you call them suspicious just for disagreeing and having a different angle. By destroying communication itself, you destroy people's ability to do counterintelligence and to work together. And that's also kind of a Russian angle, so to say, because if you look at certain styles of conversation, online or offline, certain styles of conversation, they bear all the hallmarks of mental pathologies, right? The over-emotionality, like people, they fluctuate between total doom and just being ecstatic, and the narcissism that can creep into that, or group narcissism. It's like if the conversation style continuously mimics mental illnesses, there's a problem with it, right? And you have to differentiate.
There's something about the cluster B personalities, for example, with the paranoid ideation and political thought, right? The psychopath, the narcissist, the borderline personalities, the hysteric or personalities. These are clearly in evidence, and the appeal of the conspiracy theory is largely to these personality disorders. And we see it, you've got the book Political Ponerology saying that totalitarian states and the conspiracy theories that kind of dominate their day-to-day
from Poland.
Yeah, right, exactly. Political Ponerology, that these abnormal personality types, and cluster Bs are you've got schizophrenics too, but you've got the claim that basically borderlines are type 2 psychopaths when they become paranoid or fearful. When they reach that point, they flip over. And you've got the same thing with narcissistic personality disorder being on a spectrum with psychotics and psychos. And the thing is that when you look at the way they, like you say, over emotionality and anxiety, and despair and fear, right? And it was what was Soren Kierkegaard's point about the nature of sin, that despair is a sin, is sort of the core sin, because it's the opposite of faith. And so there's some kind of, in psychological warfare, I think the Russians have understood this. They have their own, they don't follow the Western, personality disorder, the type
DSM.
They have their own way of charting this in people. And of course, human personality is so complex. It's so difficult. But by advancing this more paranoid view of things, they then amplify the negative potential of the wilderness of mirrors to make people crazy when they look at it.
Yeah.
Right?
And also, I think that what I just a thought that just popped up in my head is this in connection to what you just explained, and the thing that you talked about earlier with Tulsi Gabbard and what may be behind her strategy. When communication has broken down so much, and you see the influencers, and then you see average activists copying what the influencers say, and it's very pathological. When communication is broken down to such a degree, sometimes it may be necessary for a certain person to say what the audience wants to hear and to play into that, because that's what you have to work with. And this may be the case with Tulsi Gabbard. This may have been the case with Trump. And I mentioned this before in the show, when before the election, some comments had been made, to make the more extreme voters happy and to go vote and not stay home. Sometimes it may seem necessary to play into what's out there and to say what the audience wants to hear, because people sometimes cannot be reached anymore with reason and facts and logic, because that's always the nature of pathologies and the nature of pathologizing someone, brainwashing someone, indoctrination, cult mentality. It's always about a breakdown of your perception of reality and how to come to reasonable conclusions. So, I mean, this is something that politicians have always been complaining about, right? I mean, some get into politics, and they want to be the good guy, they want to be the honest guy, and they want to do straight talk, and then they get frustrated over and over again because communication is so bad and perception has been so bad.
Going into this, communication is so bad. Look, what really makes communication bad is the fact that who are we communicating with in modern politics and journalism? We're communicating with the masses. We're communicating with people
in groups
who are at a 12-year-old or 13-year-old
reading level,
maybe emotional and at least mental level on average. That's what you're doing. You can't really reach that many people unless it's the lowest common denominator that you have to do. Trump is very good at the way to do this. But you have this is a known thing. So what we're talking about is up here. The understanding is up here, but you can't communicate it to large numbers of people because they don't have the background or intellect or emotional disposition to handle it.
Yeah, because
so this becomes an
because that's what.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
This becomes an open area for enemy active measures, enemy psychological warfare, and propaganda to then get in and twist those minds. And how they do it is in we're talking about these cluster B personality disorders. How they do it is very interesting because, and of course, they're infiltrating, religion, university, education, government, media, books, movies, Hollywood, everything. And what they're doing with the masses is they know that your personality only exists as a unitary whole through memory. I am this. You're repeating. People we're always hypnotizing ourselves. I am this. I am doing this. I'm a good person. I'm going to do this. I'm going to help this person. I'm going to, and we're trying to follow those things we were brought up with. But and as a nation, as a group, we're doing this. And here the Soviets come in and say, oh, the CIA killed Kennedy or the generals. And we know the KGB was behind a lot of the JFK conspiracy stuff. We know that from the Mitrokhin archive and from other sources, from Mike Pachepa, Ion Pachepa, the former head of the Communist Romanian Intelligence Service. We know this. So this is a major event. They're changing it. They're changing all kinds of things in the Cold War and then the post-Cold War era. America's bad. America's imperialist. America wants to get your stuff. America's draining all these countries of their resources, when it's really the KGB, everything they're accusing you. America is involved in the drug trade. America, the Americans are the ones that are, and you get the anti-Semitic. It's the Jews behind America. America's the Zionist, it's Zog, it's Occupy, so you've got the anti-Semitic angle, you've got all these things, and these conspiracy theories break the continuity of the self and the continuity with reality. You lose reality. You kind of lose contact with your actually who you are. And this false history with its false identity of us as Americans, oh, we're bad, or we've done all these bad things. And with, oh no, Putin can fight the New World Order, all this kind of stuff. This is what they've done to try to confuse and disorganize the right, as they've already done to the left long ago.
Could you give out a, let's say, a profile of a personality behavior profile of a capable intelligence analyst, a capable person who can work with colleagues? How would this person behave? What would this person be like? Because when you look at some very famous people, I think the most easy example would be Alex Jones, who's been exhibiting behaviors on his show in front of millions of people, behaviors that seem to me like emotional instability, just uncontrolled,
which is borderline rage. By the way, emotional instability is a borderline trait.
Uncontrolled rage,
another borderline trait, and also a narcissistic trait.
Yeah, like this claiming he's the chosen one, and he's God is talking to him, and he's on this mission.
Is Jones claiming that God is talking to him now?
He's slipping that in. I mean, I remember a couple of instances where he's slipping that in, just so it's there. It's like he's talking about something, and then he slips it in, and he keeps talking about the other thing. So we saw him talk on a show with Steve Pachinik, who also I think worked in psychological operations.
A CIA psychiatrist brought in, a State Department psychologist brought in there by
guy, right?
Henry Kissinger. Yes, yeah. Kissinger brought him in.
And you watch these conversations in public between Alex Jones and a Steve Pachinik, and Pachinik is making all these weird promises that sound almost exactly like the Q
by the way,
stuff.
Already been proven. His false promises and analysis is already proven to be completely fraudulent.
And he just keeps doubling down, I think. And it's like he did that after the Capitol event. There was a show when I still have the recording somewhere on my hard drives. It's when Alex is in an emotional state as usual. There's great disappointment with Alex Jones, and then it turns into anger directed at Steve Pachinik, because Pachinik was on before on the show, and he made all these promises that sound exactly like the Q stuff, but the sources that Pachinik claimed were not cryptic postings on an online fun forum, but he claims other sources, but they pretty much say the same thing, that this crazy good stuff is going to happen, and then it didn't happen. Instead you had the Capitol events, and so then Alex Jones is disappointed and becomes emotional and angry and starts basically insulting Pachinik, and then Pachinik is they claim to be professionals, they claim to be insiders and very professional, and then they argue like this in public. And Pachinik is kind of insulting Alex Jones back, and Pachinik claims seniority. He claims he has better sources. He understands the game better. He even claims that Pachinik's background people had recruited Alex Jones for this great plan, and Jones was supposed to be the mouthpiece for that grand plan. And it just seems like such a unprofessional conversation. They should have had a pre-conversation in private and conducted themselves better.
Little bits of a head game pointing out into the.
And then they should have decided on how to talk to each other in public, in front of millions of people. Everything seems so unprofessional. So compared to that, what is the typical behaviors of intelligence professional when they work together?
Well, you need high analytical ability. You need to not be emotional in approaching anything. You need to turn your emotions off. You need to get rid of your prejudices. You need to be creative enough to think through different possibilities. And you need humility in character. You can't. A narcissist cannot be a good intelligence analyst
because he's always right.
Because he always has to be right, and a narcissist kind of believes that he's got a native genius where his first thought is always the right one. Yeah. Whereas an intelligence analyst has to go back over and say, what are my mistakes? Where have I gone wrong? Yeah. And go over it and over and over again and doubt yourself. And you have to be self-suspicious to be a good intelligence analyst, because you got to think, because if you make one mistake, one little mistake, if you're wrong about one thing, you're screwed. And the other thing is a thing that Nietzsche is like, in his Twilight of the Idols, he wrote about what is wrong with the Germans. It's a section of the book, and he says he talks about what education requires, what to be a thinker you need, and he said real education is knowing how to listen or read, knowing how to see. Actually, see is the first one, which is listening and reading. Knowing how to then think about it, and then finally knowing how to then talk about it. And so, but then he says, real willpower is required. You have to have strong willpower. And he says, why do you need strong willpower? Because the natural human urge is, well, I want to know now. I want the answer right now. It's sort of like the fast food version of thinking. It's like, no, I don't want to wait for the answer. I want the answer now. And of course, this urge to have a complete answer now is like the rush to judgment. The thing is, you have an urge to draw a hasty conclusion. And he said, no, strong willpower is withholding judgment, saying, I don't know. I'm going to think about it. I'm going to hold on to it. And of course, that's what a lot of people can't do. And especially down here at this level, people say, well, get to the answer. I don't want to, think about it too much. Just tell me what the answer is. And this is what Alex Jones and Steve Pachenik and all these conspiracy people do, is they want to give you the quick and dirty answer. And people go, yeah, that feels so good to know that. And they don't know anything. It's not a real answer. They haven't withheld judgment.
Yeah, it's like this different situation that an intelligence analyst is in, or let's say somebody in a leading position like James Angleton. I mean, to this day, I can't understand why Craig Unger, in his book on Trump and the Russians, why the author is throwing James Angleton under the bus. I mean, how many people have ever been in a position like James Angleton? How many people had this kind of responsibility and then far exceeded expectations? I mean, James Angleton was expected to do normal work and just to stay within these normal boundaries, but he kept breaking these boundaries, and he said, we have a bigger problem. It's like Soviet operations are better than we thought they were, and we have a much bigger issue, and it complicates things because we don't have that perfect safe haven. And we're not just looking for some traitors here and there. It's a much bigger issue, and he made himself unpopular with that. That's also an ability that I think you need to have. I mean, in a professional environment, you need to be respectful to a degree, and you need to cultivate relationships. But I mean, we saw even in his own office. In his own office, people started accusing him for no good reason.
Not actually in his office, but within the CIA. And the problem is that when the CIA counterintelligence group that he headed, which was the brain of the CIA, it had the ability to look at everything the CIA was doing. And Angleton had this kind of veto where he could say, all right, you're being compromised. There's something wrong with this operation. You have to stop. You have to stop the operation. To where he was stopping much of what was being done, by the intelligence sections of the CIA, especially watching the communists, the Russian bloc, the Soviet bloc. And this was holding up people's careers because they couldn't glorify themselves. They couldn't cover themselves in glory and claim these victories because Angleton was casting aspersions on these victories and saying, well, we don't know if that's true. We think we're being fed false information by double agents. And these people are just accepting it because it's good career advancement for them. Well, this is what really created the hate for Angleton in the CIA, because people feel that I've had this great achievement, I've recruited this, this asset and stuff. You can't tell me they're feeding me false information. You're the false information, this kind of thing.
Yeah. And I mean,
this is what got Angleton.
For some people, I mean, working at the CIA is not the job that people sometimes think it is, especially on the analytical side. You're not in epic gunfights all the time. You're not in enemy territory. And I think that some people even back then at the CIA, maybe some people got too comfortable. They had the status within the agency, and I mean, usually at some point, if you can only tell your relatives and your friends, well, I work for the federal government, security, sometime when they can tell their wives, I work for the CIA, it gives them a certain status, and that may feel good, and you're dealing with other people of that stature that can introduce an element of comfort, I think. But with Angleton, he saw the dangers of comfort, just doing your regular thing, then going home and drinking your whiskey and go fishing or whatever. I think Angleton, he just wouldn't let it go because he was that smart and he was that dedicated, just undertaking an even bigger task than he initially signed up for. Because when you get introduced to the agency and you go up the ranks, I mean, the mindset is this is a well-established organization, the boundaries and the methods, and we expect you to work within these structures and boundaries. And then he's the guy that says, we have a boundary problem. There's penetration of boundaries, and our thinking is way too limited. And it's just showing professional courtesy sometimes. I mean, I get emotional sometimes too. I trash, this person, that person, or the other person. But at the same time, for every person that I may publicly trash, I also show my appreciation for 10 other people, right, and their work. And I say, well, I really recommend this book, or I really recommend this thing, and I really learned a lot from that guy, and that guy. So it's like for every 10 people I recommend and show professional respect towards, then there's this one person or a group or a type of influencer or whatever that I trash in public. It seems paradoxical sometimes, but that's just the nature of that game. You need to have the capacity for professional courtesy, and the respect for other people's ideas and angles. Sometimes you have to put your foot down and say, I find this horrible, or I find that method to be highly problematic. And
I know, I agree. We have to have a certain tolerance. Look, people will criticize me saying, why are you doing this or writing this? Why are you working with these people? It's like, you got to work with whoever will work with you, right?
Yeah.
You have to struggle your way through these different issues and try to figure things out. And it's not easy. And none of us are right all the time. We make mistakes. It's normal. The idea is to get closer and closer to the truth. That's really what you want to do.
Yeah, and sometimes, I mean, you have to know your limitations. I mean, within a government agency, there's all kinds of limitations. I mean, that sometimes, mostly the press and other people, they only talk about when boundaries are broken, or when rules are bended, or sometimes rules are broken. Oh, there's a structure, but they go beyond that structure, and some people believe the CIA could do anything. They're magical. They can do everything. But once you work inside government, everything is limited. There's a limited budget. Then there's an allocation of that budget, and then it has to be discussed.
And then there's the risk-averse managers who don't want you to do your job.
Yeah, and then there's the issue of how much time and effort can we actually spend on a particular case, or can we even open a case? How many people are assigned to that case? And then you have to make the pitch, almost like a sales pitch to your superior, and say, I really think there's something there. I really think we should spend the resources. And there's kind of a competition when it comes to the allocation of resources. Why? It's not just about your salary. It's about how much money is this guy getting for his investigation? Why am I not getting more money for my investigation?
Yeah, and the CIA is way outnumbered by the KGB and by the Chinese intelligence services. They just have so many networks and agents. And then there's the criminal networks and agents. So, and then there's the problem of the CIA being infiltrated, and the U.S. universities from which they recruit intelligence officials having all this communist, or Marxist philosophical injection, where your perspective is skewed when you come out of college. So
yeah, I mean, this is like we did a whole episode. If people haven't seen it, the whole episode on the CIA. I think I called it "Call of Foofy Rainbow Ops," because like the woke era at the CIA and all that, and there's some people who appeared like in a semi-public way and somebody said that he was gay and that helped him be a better spy and all that nonsense, and the diversity casting, which sometimes is strategic and very, very useful, and sometimes it's just it makes no sense, because why is your skin pigmentation make you a better field officer? Why is your hairstyle, your hair color make you a better analyst? And it's like when you have sufficiently influenced as a foreign power like the Russians, when you have sufficiently influenced the young generation in the college scene and all that, you can work with that mindset later on. When you have the chance of recruiting an Edward Snowden, and you kind of tell him, you've always gotten for a long time you've gotten the short end of the stick. You didn't get to be a special ops warrior like you always wanted to be. You hated school, and you were basically, maybe you were bullied in school, and the system is unfair, and you don't make enough money, and we have the answer for you. And it's like this thing with Tulsi Gabbard, when I think by saying these things, Tulsi Gabbard, by saying these things about Julian Assange and Edward Snowden, that may have gotten her some sympathies from people who were genuinely concerned about the George W. Bush administration. And it may be a useful technique to get some of these people's attention and to acknowledge their previous worries and concerns with some of the stuff that the Bush administration did. It's like getting people to listen. You tell people what they want to hear. It's like a door opener. It's like an icebreaker. Yeah, it's like Snowden broke the law. Yeah, but maybe this went a bit overboard in the Bush years, with some of the spying, maybe. Or Assange, with his stupid leaks about the Iraq logs and the Afghanistan logs, that may have just been a nod by Tulsi Gabbard to a crowd that was genuinely concerned with some of the Bush era policies and the wars that happened back then.
Well, if you're going to use the Fourth Amendment to root out enemy agents within our intelligence community that are actually using our own intelligence technology to spy on Americans, that's kind of interesting to me, if that is what is suggested. And that's a theory, that's a hypothesis that crosses my mind when I'm hearing the hearings. But anyway, Alex, we're going way past 2 hours, so I think we better call it quits. I think we've covered a lot today. and we've investigated or thought through a lot of interesting questions. And so I want to thank the audience for joining us on this day going through this. And next week we'll have another discussion on these questions. I'm Jeff Nyquist in the U.S., and my co-host has been Alex Benesch. This has been Friends and Enemies.